thirsty, all who are weak, come to the fountain. Dip your heart in the stream of life. Let the pain and the sorrow be washed away in the waves of his mercy. As deep cries out to deep, come Lord Jesus, come Lord Jesus, come Lord Jesus.
Hello, welcome to Jesus for Newbies, Lesson 6. We've been going over the prophecies and everything building up to the coming of the Messiah. We looked at creation, and we looked at a specific family, the family of Abram, which God promised would become a great nation, and that nation happened. That was Israel. But God also promised that from that nation, all the people of the earth would be blessed. That nation went on. It established that at first that nation was ruled by patriarchs, then judges, and then kings. But because of rebellion against God, God divided the kingdom into the kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Israel. But God also was promising that there would be a day when those kingdoms would also cease and a new Messiah would come and establish a new kingdom. So we're going to be looking at some prophecies of Isaiah today. Now, just before the Assyrians, the Assyrians were going to conquer Israel. That was prophesied. And as a precursor to the coming of the Christ, both Israel, remember Israel was divided into two nations, Israel and Judah. But as a precursor to the coming of the Messiah, both those nations would be destroyed. Both those nations would be conquered. So just before the Assyrians would conquer Israel, God sent the prophet Isaiah to tell the people of Israel to repent and to announce the new coming of the Messiah, the Christ. So Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah began his ministry about 740 years before Jesus was born. So when we think about this word prophecy, this means that long before, and people don't argue that Isaiah was written hundreds and hundreds of years before Jesus was born. So hundreds and hundreds of years before Jesus was born, the prophet Isaiah told about the Messiah and what he would be like. And about 740 years before Jesus was born, Isaiah started his work, and 20 years before the Assyrians conquered Israel. So let's go back. Let's look at Isaiah chapter 7, verse 10. Moreover, the Lord spoke again to Ahaz, saying, "Ask for a sign for yourself from the Lord your God. Ask it either in the depth or in the height above." But Ahaz said, "I will not ask, nor will I test the Lord." Then he said, "Hear now, O house of David, it is a small thing for you to weary men, but you will weary my God also. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Curds and honey he shall eat, that he may know to refuse evil and choose good. For before the child shall know to refuse evil and choose the good, the land that you dread will be forsaken by both her kings." So God is talking to King Ahaz through the prophet Isaiah. Now, Ahaz was evil. He worshiped fake gods. And this challenge was given in verse 11. Ask a sign for yourself from the Lord your God. Ask it either in the depth or the height above. Ahaz was given this challenge by Isaiah. Ask anything and I will prove to you that God is real. Well, Ahaz was worried that he might get toasted, probably. He said, "I will not ask, nor will I test the Lord." And then Isaiah says, "Listen now, house of David." Remember, David was the great second king of Israel. He said, "Listen now, O house of David. It is a small thing for you to weary men, but you will weary my God also." He's saying that I've sent prophets like Isaiah to tell you to turn around and do what's right, and you have ignored them. He said, it's a small thing for you to weary the men, to try the patience of men, but you will try the patience of my God as well. So he says, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. So he's saying that you've rejected the prophets I've sent, and you're going to try the patience of my God as well. So he's telling them something remarkable is getting ready to happen. A new person is coming to the earth that is more than a prophet. Said, it is a small thing for you to weary men, but you will weary my God also. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and she shall call his name Emmanuel. That Emmanuel was an unusual name. It wasn't a name normally given to children. I know it's used now, but the word Emmanuel means God with us. Here, the prophet Isaiah says, Ahaz, you name it, and I'll prove to you that God is real. He said, I'm not going to ask for a sign from the Lord. Then Isaiah says, you've tried the patience of men, you're going to try the patience of God as well. But the Lord is going to give you a sign. Behold, a virgin, a young woman who hasn't had relations with a man, is going to be born into this earth. And the child from her will be the Christ, the Messiah. But he tells us that this Messiah was going to be a different kind of king. This Messiah was going to be the Emmanuel. Emmanuel means God with us. So Isaiah is announcing that this promise was that part of God was going to become incarnate in the world. That this Messiah that was going to be born, and you know, this is about 740 years before Jesus was born. He said this Messiah that's going to be born is going to be more than a prophet, more than a teacher, that this Messiah would be part of God incarnate in the world, the Emmanuel, the God with us. He said you'll be able to tell that this is true because all of a sudden a young woman, a virgin who hasn't had sex, will become pregnant. And that is a sign to you that the child is coming. The Emmanuel is coming. If we look at verse 17, the Lord will bring the king of Assyria upon you, and your people and your father's house, days that have not come since the day that Ephraim departed from Judah. And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord will whistle for the fly that is in the farthest part of the rivers of Egypt, and for the bee that is in the land of Assyria. They will come, and all of them will rest in the desolate valleys and in the clefts of the rocks and on the thorns and on the pastures. Isaiah was pronouncing judgment on King Ahaz. He says, ever since the nations were divided and there was Ephraim, or another word for Israel, and Judah, he said nothing like this has ever happened. But I'm bringing the king of Assyria here, and he's going to conquer you. The nation of Israel is going to cease to exist. But I'm telling you about a new king that's coming, a Messiah, a Christ. But this Christ is going to be different because he will be the Emmanuel, the God with us. That Christ, that Messiah would be the Emmanuel. And this is, I believe it's a copy of a coin from King Ahaz. Let's turn to Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6. So once again, this is written about 700 years before Jesus is born. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will rest upon his shoulder. And his name will be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end, upon the throne of David and over his kingdom, to order and establish it with justice, judgment, and justice. From then on, from that time forward and forever, the zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. So remember, this is Isaiah. Isaiah's told the king that your nation is going to come to an end. The Assyrians are going to conquer it, but I'm bringing a Messiah to establish a new people for God's own possession. And here he's telling what that Messiah would be like. the first thing he says is, for a child will be born to us. Isn't that a surprising thing when you think of part of God coming to the earth, that part of God would be born as a child? Can you imagine Mary holding a baby in her arms and thinking that baby helped create the world? He says that Messiah, that Emmanuel, that God with us, would be born as a child. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will rest upon his shoulders, and his name shall be called. He tells us different attributes about the Messiah. Isaiah is telling us different attributes the Messiah would have by telling us different names that he would wear. The first name given is wonderful. You know, when you think of the word wonderful, you usually use that word when there's no other word that fits. It's almost too good to be described. He said the name of the Messiah, the Christ that is coming, would be wonderful. The next name is Counselor. Someone who listens and gives answers. You know, sometimes the value of someone who will just listen is incalculable. The Messiah would be a counselor. Mighty God. The next attribute, first, he announces boldly and unequivocally that the Messiah would be God incarnate, the Emmanuel, the God with us. He would be mighty God. Why do you need a mighty God as a Christ, as a Messiah? You know, when I was a kid, I used to go fishing with my dad. And we would go fishing, and we always had those Zebco 33 reels. And I always got my Zebco reel all tangled up with line. And my dad would take my fishing pole, and then he would fish with his, he would untangle my pole, and I would fish with his. And then pretty soon I'd have his pole all tangled up, and we would trade again. I always caught more fish than my dad. But the reason you need to understand that Jesus is mighty God is because sometimes we get our lives all so tangled up that we can't untangle it. You know, it'd be hard for a little kid to untangle fishing line. It's so tight, so tight. And kids aren't that patient. Sometimes we get our life so tangled up, we can't untangle it ourselves, and we need help. The reason I want you to understand that Jesus is mighty God is that first, he is part of God incarnate in the world. He is mighty. He can undo things that you can't undo. He can straighten things that you can't straighten. He can untangle your life if you just bring it to him. That question of the gospel, the question of, should I give my life to Jesus or not, is a question of, is your life tangled? And do you need a mighty God to help you untangle it? The next name it tells us that the Messiah would wear is Everlasting Father, a forever Father. You know, sometimes people get to the idea that they've messed up or they've shamed themselves so much that God doesn't love them anymore, and that's not the truth. He tells us that this Jesus, this Christ that's coming into the world is a different kind of father. You know, fathers on this earth aren't perfect. I'm a dad and I'm not perfect. But here Jesus says that the Messiah would be a forever Father, an everlasting Father. And if you've done things you're ashamed of, or if you've done things that you regret, and you think God doesn't want you back into his family, I want you to understand that Jesus is an everlasting Father and that he does. He loves you. He wants you in his family. The next name it tells us that the Messiah would wear is Prince of Peace, a ruler of peace. That Jesus would be a ruler, but of peace. You know, sometimes, I don't know if you've ever had a bad boss or a rotten boss in your life, and sometimes we do, don't we? Sometimes we get a rotten boss in our life. I just want you to understand that giving your life to Jesus, to giving him ownership of your life, it is giving your life over to someone who wants peace for you. You know, your boss may not want peace for you. You may have a grouchy teacher that doesn't want peace for you. But I want you to understand, when you're contemplating the truth of the gospel and whether to make Jesus the ruler of your life, I want you to understand that he's a ruler of peace, a prince of peace. He tells us that Jesus would rule on the throne of David. Now, Jesus was going to be a direct descendant of David. If you look at Matthew chapter 1 or Luke chapter 3, you can see that Jesus is the direct descendant of David. If you're trying to figure out who's going to be king or queen of England, you look at their lineage. Here it tells us that the Messiah, the Christ, would be a direct lineage of David. A surprise about the Messiah is that he wasn't going to be loved. Let's turn to Isaiah chapter 53, verse 1. Who has believed our report? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground. He has no form of comeliness. And when we see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. He's despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. This is kind of a surprising prophecy about the Messiah. The first thing he tells us is the Messiah wouldn't be good looking. He has no form of comeliness, and when we see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. So he announces that when the Messiah comes, he wouldn't be like this really good-looking guy. Now, to me, it surprises me. If I had a choice, I'd be really good-looking, wouldn't you? Why would Jesus come and be average-looking? In order to add and subtract fractions, you have to find the lowest common denominator. Jesus was going to be everyone's Messiah. Everyone who struggles, everyone, sometimes we look at those really good looking people and we think they got it better than us. But I'm telling you, Jesus wasn't. He's everybody's Messiah, everybody's Christ. And when he chose to come to the earth, he chose to come without physical beauty. Another surprise in verse 3, he is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. What would it be like? What would it be like for a child growing up and he was perfectly honest, perfectly kind, perfectly loving, perfectly innocent? What would it be like for him among his peers? What would it be like for him among young people his own age? That's Jesus. He's just perfect. Would he get picked on? A lot of times I think you can make the comparison to a mentally handicapped child. Sometimes they're the most loving and kind kids in the school, and yet they get picked on. Jesus was perfectly loving, perfectly kind, perfectly noble. But he was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, one from whom men hide their face, one from whom men pretend not to know. I think if a person came into this world and they were perfectly honest, perfectly kind, perfectly noble, that we would kill him again. So he wasn't popular. He was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, one from whom men hide their face. Let's look at verse 4. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastising for our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Why would God come to the earth? Jesus came to the earth knowing that if that kind of perfection, that kind of perfect love, perfect kindness, perfect openness, perfect nobility came to the earth, Jesus knew we couldn't handle it and that we would kill him. He knew that the moment he stepped foot on this earth that we would kill him. It's kind of like what would happen if you took a lamb from the petting zoo and put it in with the wolves in the zoo. What would happen? But he came anyway. He came knowing we would kill him. Here, this text was written over 700 years before Jesus was born, and he's telling them that that he was going to die on the cross. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. If you think about the battle between good and evil, the battle that Jesus came to fight was the battle between love and hate, the battle between truth and deception. And the thing that Satan didn't understand was this love God had for humanity. What would happen? What would happen if you went to visit your child's house and they were rude to you and wouldn't open the door? And then you went back and they beat you up. And then they went back and they beat you up worse and nearly killed you. And then you went back and they ultimately killed you. What would happen? Would there be a point in that process where you would stop coming to your children? God sent prophets to tell his children to turn around, to stop being evil. And in the ultimate show of love, God sent his son, whom was part of himself, incarnate in the world. And we ended up torturing him and killing him. The thing Satan didn't understand, the thing he didn't understand was love. Remember that battle between good and evil is a battle between love and hate. So the thing Satan doesn't understand is love. And when Satan was trying to get God to reject humanity, Satan had humanity attack Jesus in every single way possible, to the point they tortured him and killed him on the cross. And 3 days later, something amazing happened. 3 days later, Jesus rose from the dead. Jesus returned to the children who had rejected him with hate, rejected him with violence, rejected him with murder. Came back 3 days later, and something about that made us victorious. Something about that gave love the victory over hate. And he tells us he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement for our peace was upon him. And by his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. We have become lost, like lost sheep. And Jesus and God loved us to the point he came to the earth as a shepherd to show us the way home, even though he knew we would kill him, torture him, and kill him. Let's look at verse 7. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and his sheep before the shearers silent, so he opened not his mouth. He was taken from prison, from judgment, and who will declare his generation? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was stricken, and they made his grave with the wicked, but with the rich man at his death, because he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Jesus came perfectly honest, perfectly kind, perfectly noble to this world, and we rejected him to the point we killed him. As a lamb before his silent, Jesus didn't fight what happened. He was cut off from the land of the living. In verse 9 it says, and they made his grave with the wicked, but with the rich man at his death. Something remarkable happened at the cross. If we look back, of course, this is 700 and some years later. In John chapter 19, it says, after this, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him permission. So he came and took the body. And Jesus, this prophecy was fulfilled, that Jesus would be laid in a rich man's grave. So all of this is coming, right now we're looking at prophecies predicting the coming of the Christ. But hundreds of years before Jesus came to the world, the Bible announced that he was coming. that there was going to be an Emmanuel, a God with us, born of a virgin, and he was coming to show us our way home. He would be a wonderful counselor, everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, and he would reign on the throne of David. And this was getting ready to take place. The Messiah was coming. He wasn't going to be popular. He wasn't going to be good looking, but he was coming to save the children of God, the people who turned towards him. See, this is the gospel story. The gospel story from the beginning of time was this promise that the Messiah was coming, and Jesus did come. Now, the question I want you, as we're going through this Bible study, to ask yourself, because it's a remarkable idea that part of God became incarnate on the earth, that there is an Emmanuel. I want you to ask yourself if you believe Jesus was the Christ. And when you get to the point where you believe Jesus is the Christ, it's time to confess that and repent of your sins and be baptized for remission of your sins. This is the gospel story, the gospel, the promise of Jesus, the incarnation of Jesus, and the resurrection of Jesus. Thank you for joining us for Jesus for Newbies. We'll have another lesson next week.